Good evening and good morning, everyone. My name is Salah, and I'm a visiting researcher at Weekend AIP. Today, I'm going to host this seminar, this TrustML Young Scientist Seminar. But before we start, let me allow me to briefly introduce Weekend AIP to our valuable guests. So the full name of the organization is RIKEN Center for Advanced Intelligence Project, so AIP. It was founded in 2016 as a research center for the next AIP project. So this center conducts Japan's leading AI research, which is headed by Professor Sugiyama. AIP aims to enhance AI fundamental technology and its real-world applications. It also tries to promote and encourage collaborations with various researchers and engineers in various worlds and fields. And today we welcome various researchers during the seminar, and we will also be grateful if you could visit us in Nihonbashi offices in Tokyo in the near future. Before we start, I just want to remind you that even if the presentation is recorded, any reproduction requires the permission of the author. And I am very delighted to welcome Olivia Wiles, our guest today. She will be talking about rigorous evaluation of machine learning models. I will just introduce her briefly. She's a senior researcher at DeepMind, working on robustness in machine learning. She focuses on how to detect and mitigate failures arising from spurious correlation and distribution shifts. And prior to her research now, she was a PhD student at Oxford with Andrew Ziderman, studying self-supervised representation for 3D. And she spent the summer at FAIR working on view synthesis with Justin Johnson, Giorgio Gioxari, and Rick Zeliski. I'm sorry if the name were not that great. Thanks again, Olivia, for joining us today, and feel free to share your screen and start your talk.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, so I'll be giving my talk on rigorous evaluation of machine learning models. And so as we all know, machine learning models are not robust. So despite achieving superhuman accuracy on benchmarks like ImageNet, these models can be susceptible to small adversarial perturbations that are invisible to the human eye. And models are prone to learning shortcuts and exploiting spurious correlations. And this means that we can take a model that seems to perform well, and then we apply it in a new scenario, and it has poorer performance. But these issues aren't necessarily limited to ImageNet. They can also arise in models that are trained on significantly larger data sets and on other modalities. And so why is this happening? So the meta problem is that we have this model or agent which is trained with some amount of data and experience. And this may be biased or limited or sensitive in some way. And then if we think about using this model in another scenario, then issues may arise due to bias, long tail the distribution, out of distribution data, or even a malicious actor. And so in the face of these challenges, how do we have any idea of how our model will behave once it's deployed? And so that's the questions that I've been interested in my research. And the first question that I'll be thinking about is how can we build tools to better understand how our models will behave in reality? And there are two things that we've investigated. So one is looking at more rigorous benchmarking, and the second is trying to develop automated evaluation tools. So the first stream of work I'll be talking about is rigorously benchmarking performance as conditions vary. So the motivation for this work comes from the standard classification problem, where we have some label and image, and we want a classifier to classify the images. And if we take a data set like ImageNet, which is very challenging, we can still achieve really impressive performance, greater than 85% on the test set. But if we go and take this model and apply it to a new data set, like this data set of cartoons or drawings, then will the model work? And the answer is that no, the model is not trained on cartoons, so it may not generalize to this new domain, getting only 38% top one accuracy on the new domain. And these types of distribution shift are prevalent in machine learning. And even if we obtain data at scale, and here are some examples of this. So if we just perform queries on Google search, for example, here is a query for camel. Then we can see that most camels are in the desert, which means the model may fail to generalize to seeing camels in new contexts. We can get geographical bias of what it means to have a wedding, and we can get capture bias where we see that most mugs are visualized in a certain orientation. And so these kind of spurious correlations naturally occur in large-scale web data. So just collecting more data will not necessarily solve the issue. And there's been a huge amount of work on creating data sets and benchmarks to investigate these issues by combining different object detection data sets or synthetically creating shifts using background manipulation or corrupting the images. And these are really interesting data sets, but they don't necessarily look at problems that arise in the real world, which led to the creation of the Wiles benchmark, which seeks to aggregate different naturally occurring distribution shifts, such as medical imagery or camera trap imagery. And so I'll be talking about our work on a fine-grained analysis on distribution shift. And here our work is complementary to those works described before, as we first seek to define how different shifts arise and how models can be made invariant to those shifts. We then develop an experimental framework to allow control over the amount and type of distribution shift. So the first question is, why should models generalize? And here we take a simple example of synthetic shapes, which vary in shape, color, size, position, and orientation. And we call these the attributes of the underlying distribution. And there may be many. And each attribute can take on a set of values. So for example, in color, we can have green, red, blue. And one is a label for which we wish to do classification. And what we assume is that there is some distribution over inputs and attributes, but instead of having data from there, we have data from two distinct distributions, the train and the test. And our point is that while these distributions may be disjoint, they're both related to that true distribution. And the question is then, why should we generalize from train to test? And so in this work, we took inspiration from disentanglement literature in order to find these relationships and thereby how the distribution shifts arise. So we assumed that we had a latent variable model, and we used this to define the joint distribution as the product of the marginal distribution over the attributes and the conditional generative distribution. So then shifts arise as the marginal distribution changes, but the conditional generative model remains the same. And we had this kind of assumption or notion that the conditional generative model is staying fixed as we assume that it's describing some process that's true in the world. And the question is, why should we be able to generalize? And what we do is we took different common approaches and we tried to think about how they work in our framework. So the first is weighted resampling. And here we can use important weights to resample the training set, making it look more like the true distribution. And thereby, when we train our model on this new distribution, it will potentially be more robust than simply training with the training distribution. Second, we can use data augmentation to try to approximate the conditional generative model and thereby rebalance the data set. And finally, we can use representation learning to try to learn the true prior over the latent variable Z. And then if Y and X are independent, we should be able to generalize to the test set. So the next thing was to develop an experimental framework to compare model performance across varying amounts of available data and types of distribution shift. So there are 6 data sets. We chose one attribute to be the label and one the attribute that varies. And the different rows show a different attribute being varied. For example, with D-sprites, the aim is to predict the label, but shapes vary in color, such as green and blue, as shown here. So we evaluated 3 shifts, as visualized here, again, for this D-sprites dataset. So we visualized the joint distribution for each distribution shift over the attribute and the label, where lighter means higher probability and darker means lower. So first, we looked at spurious correlation, and here we're looking at spurious correlation between color and shape. Second, we looked at low data drift, where a given value of the attribute, such as red, is only seen a handful of times. And finally, unseen data shift, where the value of an attribute is simply unseen. And in order to construct these shifts across these 6 data sets, we developed an API that can be used to specify distribution and how to compose these distributions. So at a high level, we specify that we want only certain colors in one distribution, and then we can control the type of distribution as well as the amount of shift, and combine different distributions together to create more complex shifts. We then evaluated 19 models, which we bucketed into the 6 general approaches, which are shown here. So here we have architecture choice, heuristic data augmentation, learned data augmentation, domain generalization, adaptive approaches, and representation learning. And we trained over 80,000 models across these 3 different distribution shifts, 6 data sets, and we also looked at 2 additional conditions, the noise and the size of the data set, which I'm not going to talk about here. And we ran hyperparameter sweeps over 5 seeds and averaged the results over these 5 seeds. And here we show the results for the shifts for a subset of the methods encompassing the different kind of general approaches. So I include the complete set of results in the paper, and here I'm just going to give a high-level overview of some of the interesting takeaway points that we had in the paper. So for these different shifts, so for spurious correlation and low data drift, we vary the severity of the shift. So that's one of the interesting things, is that we can vary the amount of the shift, and then we can look at how models perform. So here, smaller values of n denote a more severe shift. So that means that there are more correlated examples or fewer samples from the low data region. And then a higher value of n denotes a smaller shift. So these should be easier to train on. And we plot the average % improvement over a baseline ResNet, which is shown to the left. And here, blue is better and red is worse. So first, we can see that multiple methods improve over the ERM baseline, but not always the same ones. So for example, CycleGAN does best in general in the spurious correlation setting, but pre-training in the low data drift setting. Second, we can see that across different distribution shifts, pre-training and augmentation can be highly effective, but that the best algorithm differs under the precise condition. So just if we vary the amount of shift, we can see that the models that are doing best vary quite a lot. And additionally, we found limited performance improvement from domain generalization methods, requiring more research here. And finally, the choice of data set and attribute to induce the shift impact the utility of different heuristic augmentations and model performance. So on D sprites, if we make shape the label and color the attribute, then few models achieve 100%. But instead, if we make color the label and shape the attribute for inducing the shift, then all models do well. And that was just kind of a very brief summary of some of the results and conclusions that we came to after doing this large experiment. But another interesting aspect was that this work led to a lot of interesting questions that came about and interesting directions to potentially try to understand further. So the first is, how can we decide on the best method for a given data set or distribution shift without running all methods? And the second question is, we found that performance was dependent on the domain and the amount of shift. So should we only focus on applications where we know the shift, or should we be focusing more on adaptable algorithms? And finally, we found that performance varies due to a variety of conditions, such as dataset noise, shift, etc. So should we evaluate under all conditions or just the ones we care about for an application? And how can we determine those precise conditions for a given application? So I'll move away from the rigorously evaluating models and move on to open-ended failure discovery. So this work is on the stream of work on trying to create tools to evaluate our models in an automatic fashion. And we were inspired by the fact that there don't really exist many tools for such a problem. So we can think about adversarial perturbations or semantic perturbations, but they don't allow for a lot of creativity on the part of the person investigating the model. And this is partially because finding failures in vision models is really hard. So for a pre-trained model, how can we even go about finding new scenarios where it fails and investigating biases in these models? So there's been a lot of interesting work in this area. So first, we can go out and collect more real data. And here, Hendrix has done quite a lot of work on looking at natural adversarial examples or distribution or data sets that are to some extent distribution shifts of the original ImageNet. We can also create synthetic data sets where we investigate a particular potential problem of a model. So for example, we have ImageNet C, where we can look at common corruptions. Also, we can look at texture shape queue conflict with stylized ImageNet, or the impact of background cues on model bias with ImageNet 9 or waterbirds. But none of these are automated. So, if we have a new problem that we want to investigate, then we're going to have to go out and collect a new data set to investigate that potential problem. And so existing automatic tools include adversarial examples, but here we're quite limited in terms of the kinds of failures that we can investigate. So we can look at language-based templates or LP norm-bounded perturbations. And we can try to go beyond that by using generative and perceptual models, but these become quite difficult to automate. And so I'll be presenting this work on discovering bugs in vision models using off-the-shelf image generation and captioning. And here the motivation was, as I was saying, how do we evaluate models on how they'll perform in various scenarios? And this is because labeled data is expensive and difficult to obtain. Synthetic data must be hand devised to test for spurious correlations or properties of the model. And this can be very challenging and hard to scale. And then automatic tools like LP norm-bounded robustness or adversarial examples are limited by the constraints of the tool or the definition of the tool. So to this end, we devised a method for discovering failures in image classifiers automatically, and we used off-the-shelf large-scale models. So our approach does not rely on collecting new data sets or manually crafting heuristics. And instead, the failures are human interpretable, as we can describe failures in natural language using a captioning tool. And then these captions can be further probed and modified to understand what parts of the caption impact the failure rate. And finally, we demonstrate the scalability of the approach by generating adversarial data sets that are akin to ImageNet A, but instead of ImageNet A, our new data sets are more closely aligned to the original training distribution from ImageNet, and we can also generalize to multiple classifier architectures. So this is just a sneak peek of what the results are going to look like. So here are some examples of failures that are automatically found by our model. So first, we can see that the mushroom is misclassified as a candle, or the bee is a soap dispenser, and the robin on the branch looks a bit like a lizard with the red neck. So I'll first describe the setup in brief using the mathematical notation, and then I'll give a more intuitive overview of how it works. So we assume we have a classifier that takes images as input and maps them to a set of labels. We also have some true distribution of images given the label. We also have a description of an image given a label and caption. And now the aim is to find a caption such that the failure rate for that caption is much greater than the failure rate when generating images just for that specific label. And we can also look at this for a specific misclassification. So if we want to look at when does a certain image get misclassified for a certain label. And another note is that instead of the true distribution of images given the label, we have an approximation of it in the form of a text-to-image model as well. So let's look at this approach in more detail. So first, we generate images from the baseline prompt, such as a realistic photograph of a fly insect, and we measure the failure rate. Second, we take the failures. So here we can see that one image was misclassified as B in the first step. And so we take all these failures and then we cluster them using some kind of similarity in feature space. We then take a cluster and we caption it to find a natural language description of the cluster. We then generate failures from this caption. So for example, for that cluster, the caption that we automatically find is a realistic photograph of a fly insect. It is on a yellow flower. The background is green. So now we take that caption and we regenerate images according to that caption. So now you can see we get a lot more flies on yellow flowers with green backgrounds. And we remeasure the failure rate. And what we can see is that now the failure rate goes up. So we're getting more instances where the flies are misclassified as bees. So when we compare them to the original base failure rate, we can see that it's gone up, implying that this is a failure of the model. And then the final thing we can do in the fourth step is that we can refine the caption to find the simplest caption that still induces a similar failure rate. So here what we can do is just follow simple heuristics like dropping sentences or adjectives, and we end up with the phrase, a realistic photograph of a fly insect, it is on a flower. And again, we have these flies on flowers, and the failure rate is now similar to what we got with the more complex caption. And so this is how the method works. We start with some base caption, we generate some images, we have a base failure rate, we find the ones where it fails, we cluster them, we find, we recaption the cluster, and then we generate images according to this new caption. And again, we remeasure the failure rate. And if it goes up significantly, then that implies that this is a true failure of the model. And so let's look at this in a bit more detail in terms of the actual numbers. So here we took two random classes, fly and crayfish, and two target classes, bee and chain link fence, and we run the pipeline. And so what we want to see is if we can find a cluster where the misclassification rate for that target class goes up significantly. And what we can see is that at the moment, the fly is misclassified as bee less than 1% of the time, which we can see by the horizontal red bar shown to the left. And the crayfish, which is misclassified as chain link fence, is much further down the list, so it is not shown here. But we run our pipeline and we get these new clusters. So we get a realistic photograph of a fly, it is on a flower, and a realistic photograph of a crayfish, it is in a net. And this dramatically increases the misclassification error. So fly to bee goes up 497 times, and crayfish to chain link fence goes up 3,000 plus times. So this implies that these are actual and real failure cases of the model. And we can also test our out the found failure cases on other generative models like DALL-E and Stable Diffusion to demonstrate that these failure cases also arise with their generated images. So here we prompt these models with the original caption, so a realistic photograph of a fly, and then with the modified caption, so with the addition of it is on a flower. And then we look at the number of failure cases that confuse fly with bee. And we see that they increase from the basic prompt, and similarly for crayfish. So there's also another interesting point about kind of the other types of failures that maybe arise with these models. So here with Stable Diffusion, we can see that the number incorrect goes up, but we also get this other interesting failure for spiderweb and strainer, which is visually similar to net and also is maybe induced by these kinds of similar visual features that are confusing the model. And the final thing that we look at is how these failures generalize to real images. So we can use Google image search and use these queries as prompts or searches. So we take, again, the base prompt, a realistic photograph of a fly, and then again, the modified one, it is on a flower. And then again, we look at the failure rates and to see if they go up, and in particular, if the failure rate for the target class goes up. And we can see that, again, this is true. So our failure cases seem to even generalize to real images. And here's some additional found failures. So the green shows the true class. So for example, Jeep is the true class, and it's being misclassified as snowplow, which is the misclassified class, which is shown in red. And this is quite interesting because you can see that some of the failures are presumably because of maybe colors, like the CNN Manita Daisy. And we can also see that we rediscover failures that are known in the literature, such as Jeep to snowplow. So another nice property of our setup is that we can transfer failure cases that were, say, generated by fooling ResNet 50 or VIT to other models successfully. So for example, the ResNet transfers 80% to another ResNet, and the VIT transfers 77% of the time to another VIT. We can also transfer to much larger models, such as the VIT-B and ResNet 152. And here we notice trends where better models, so those that are potentially pre-trained on much larger data sets, such as ImageNet 21K, are more robust against the found failures from, say, the ResNet 50 or the VIT, but they're not universally so. So these failures do transfer to some extent to these other data sets. And finally, we discussed some of the further challenges and next steps. So the first challenge is coverage. The generative model is unlikely to generate objects and animals in uncommon conditions. So for example, here we have a Persian cat in the snow, and it's very unlikely that the generative model will generate this just from the caption, a realistic photograph of a Persian cat. And also, we can't guarantee the absence of failures. So because we are kind of demonstrating that there are failures, we can't say, generate all possible images of cats and then say it has not failed, so there is no failure. The second challenge is bias. So the generative model may overrepresent certain objects or conditions. So for example, blue crayfish are very rare in the wild, but they're overrepresented by the generative model, presumably because people get excited when they see a blue crayfish and they take a photo. The third challenge is captioning. So it may be very difficult to describe precisely in words why a failure arises. So here the crayfish is confused for a net, but how to explain the positioning of claws and the pose such that the generative model creates similar images is challenging. And the final challenge is generation issues. So sometimes the generative model does not precisely follow the prompt. So here salt shaker was in the prompt, but while there is salt, there is no salt shaker. So I've shown two methods for improving the robustness to specifications through standard adversarial, so I've shown two methods for improving the robustness. So one was looking at rigorously evaluating models under varying conditions. And one was looking at how do we create these automatic tools in order to find failures in models before they, say, arise in an application of the model. And in the last few minutes, I thought it'd be interesting to take a step back and think about what we need to build reliable, trustworthy AI. And in particular, how can we systematically evaluate our ML models when we're going to, say, be using them in these scenarios where things may be changing or they may not be quite what we had for our training set. And so I think that there's a few things along this kind of road to deployment that we can think about. So the first is that when we build our ML model, we can really think about evaluating rigorously. And so we can think about building evaluation data sets that don't just capture a snapshot of how the model will be deployed, but a range of scenarios. And the second is that we can create automated evaluation tools. So let's not wait for things to fail. Let's build tools that try to find failures at scale before they arise in practice. And the final aspect is that, we want to always be improving our evaluation setup. So a model is never finished. We can use information that's gathered from deployment to improve the model, update the rigorous evaluation benchmarks, or feed into our automated systems. And hopefully in this way, then we can have more confidence in our models and a better understanding of how they're going to work in practice. And thank you. I think that concludes my talk. So if there are any questions, then please raise them now.
Thank you very much, Olivia, for this very fascinating talk. More about both about the methodology and also about the result that you got. We got some questions in the chat. I don't know if Sangun, you want to speak up or to ask your question, or do you want me to read it?
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, thank you for a very interesting talk. I've been thinking about similar stuff these days. So my question was, how can you automatically confirm that the generation is faithful? So in this example, you are aiming to generate an image of a fly, but if generative model is not perfect, it may not generate a fly, or it's even like GANs sometimes generate a weird not faithful images.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So first, we did do some studies on looking at how often the generative model that we were using was actually representing the class of interest. And so there's a couple of things. So first, it was reasonably accurate. So maybe 3% of the time, it didn't generate the precise right class. But in the work, we didn't just look at failures that were, say, a fly getting confused with another kind of insect. We looked at more holistic failures where it's in the wrong WordNet hierarchy. So we'd go up the WordNet hierarchy, go up 2 parents, and then all of the classes below that we treat as not a failure. Because if we're getting different types of dogs confused, that's not necessarily so problematic than if we're getting umbrella and spider confused, where it's completely different. And then if we look at that, then the number of times that the generative model is generating the wrong image is about 1% of the time. So it's very small. And so I think it is reasonably accurate, so we can find these failures automatically. We do find them. And in practice, we wouldn't expect this to just run completely independently. We would expect some human interaction where we surface these failures and someone decides that this is a true failure and they want to add it to their data set in order to evaluate downstream versions of their model. So I think there's a few points to the answer. So one is that they are reasonably accurate, that you can run these at scale, and it's not failing so often that the majority of your failure cases that you find are wrong. The majority are right. But you're right, there are a couple that may be wrong, but if you imagine that actually it's going to be someone in the loop, then you wouldn't just run it by itself, because then you need that human in the loop to make sure that the evaluation is doing something helpful. So yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, perfectly. Yeah, thank you so much.
I actually have a follow-up question. In the process that you presented in the step 2, you mentioned the captioning of the clusters. So the captioning is done by manual labelers or domain experts, or how is it done?
No, so that's done automatically. So how that works is that, let me just go back to the slide. So what we do is we take a VLM model and we caption the cluster using that. So what we do is that we find the most likely caption for all the images in the cluster, a sentence at a time. So we basically caption each image, we get a bunch of sentences, and then we take each sentence and we see if that's going to maximize the likelihood if we add that as the next sentence to the caption over all the images in the cluster. So that's done automatically.
Okay, thanks. I see.
Speaking of the captioning process, have you considered like optimizing the captioning process itself? I mean, in adversarially, perhaps?
Yeah, we haven't explored a lot of different approaches. So the pipeline is a bit, it's an engineering task to get it set up and to get it running. So we haven't investigated a lot of different approaches for both the captioning and the generation. We kind of use the simplest approach and it worked kind of out of the box. But you're right, it would be interesting to explore different types of captioning methods and potentially adversarial, potentially different types of constraints put on the generation process that could maybe make it a bit faster. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of different avenues to explore there.
Yeah, thank you.
Any more questions in the chat, so you can say them as well? I do have one about the first part, because one of the results that you got was about the fact that domain generalization algorithm offers limited performance improvements. I was very surprised by this result. Do you have an idea of why it's not working that well?
So I think this is actually something that's been found in another study that was by some people from Facebook in search of lost domain generalization. And I think the thing that changes potentially from papers that are looking at these domain generalization methods is that if you have kind of a fixed budget in terms of doing your hyperparameter search or making those kinds of choices, then maybe it's harder to find the performance gains because maybe you've like trained a lot of models for your domain generalization. You found like that hyperparameter that works really well. But if you have a fixed budget, then maybe it's harder to find that. So then it's not as useful. I think they should be helpful. I don't want to be negative in that their potential use. I just think that maybe they need to be kind of evaluated under the slightly more realistic conditions where you wouldn't like say run ERM once and then you'd run your domain generalization a huge number of times. And then, so maybe there needs to be more work in terms of how you do the kind of model selection more efficiently, or better choices in terms of how you choose the hyperparameter sweep. And then that would potentially show their value in such a setting again.
I see. Thank you very much. Thanks. Any last question before we close the session?
Can I ask one more follow-up question? Maybe it's a more like a clarifying question, but is the caption, so caption is refined, but it's refined in a way that it's more concise? Or I mean,
so
I was wondering that
if
is the caption is up, is the caption optimized for the error rate?
Yeah, it's what you said initially. It's more to make it more concise. The idea being that if we're trying to figure out what this spurious correlation is that's causing this failure, then we want the simplest explanation. So not that, it's on a yellow flower, the background is green, because maybe the background is green doesn't matter, but the fact that it's on a flower is the important thing.
I see. Yeah, thank you so much.
So we will put the recording of the session on YouTube by next week. And on the website, you also have contact information of Olivia and her work. And I think I will also add the papers related to your presentation as well on the website. Cool. Thank you again, Olivia, for this great talk. And thanks for all the audience for joining us today. And see
Thank you for
in
having me.
the next sessions. Have a nice day, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.